There's a version of this story that never made it into the music magazines. It didn't happen on a stage. There was no crowd, no cameras, no lights, no Marshall stacks shaking the walls. It happened in a quiet room in London in the late autumn of 1967, with about 15 people watching something they wouldn't fully understand until years later. Andrés Segovia was 74 years old that night. Some accounts say 75. Either way, he had been playing classical guitar longer than most people in that room had been alive. He was the man who had taken the guitar out of taverns and put it in concert halls, who had forced orchestras to take the instrument seriously, who had spent 5 decades building a case that the guitar deserved to stand next to the violin, the piano, the cello, that it was not a folk instrument, not a background instrument, not a toy. He had largely won that argument. And then rock and roll happened. Segovia didn't talk about rock music often. When he did, he wasn't cruel about it. He was something worse. He was dismissive. In a 1967 interview with a European music journal, he said something that got passed around in certain circles. The quote was simple. He said the electric guitar was not a musical instrument in any serious sense. It was an amplifier for impulse. Anyone could plug in and make noise. The difficulty, he said, was in restraint, in silence, in the things you choose not to play. He wasn't talking about Jimi Hendrix specifically, but someone made sure Jimi heard it anyway. Jimi read the quote, or had it read to him, depending on who's telling the story. He didn't get angry. He didn't say anything particularly memorable in response. He just smiled slightly, the way he sometimes did when someone said something he found more interesting than offensive. That smile meant something. People who knew him knew that. The gathering was organized by a small cultural foundation that was trying to build bridges between the classical world and the new rock scene. It sounds naive now. It probably sounded naive then. But it was 1967 in London, and people still believed that kind of thing was possible, that you could put Segovia and the musicians who were setting the city on fire in the same room, and something useful would happen. The venue was a private townhouse near Kensington. High ceilings, old wood paneling, the kind of place that had absorbed 100 years of serious conversation. Segovia arrived early and sat near the window. He wore a dark jacket and kept his hands folded in his lap. He watched people come in with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting for music to begin. Jimi arrived late with one other person. He wasn't dressed for the occasion, or rather he was dressed exactly the way he always dressed, which in that room stood out considerably. He found a chair near the back and sat down without making any particular entrance. He didn't perform the social rituals that a room like that usually demanded. He just watched, the same way Segovia was watching, from a different corner. Nobody planned what happened next, or if someone did, they never admitted to it. An intermediary, a musician who knew both worlds and moved between them comfortably, approached Segovia at one point in the evening. He said something quietly. Segovia listened, then looked across the room toward Jimi for the first time. Then the same person walked over to Jimi. He said that Segovia had a question, not a challenge exactly, a question. He wanted to know if Jimi would be willing to play something on an acoustic guitar, without amplification, just to hear it. The room had begun to notice that something was happening, though most people couldn't hear the conversation. They noticed the direction of glances, the slight shift in the atmosphere, the way certain people had stopped their own conversations and were watching without being obvious about it. Jimi didn't answer immediately. He looked across the room at Segovia, who was looking back at him with an expression that was completely neutral, not hostile, not warm, the face of someone conducting an evaluation. Then Jimi said yes. Someone brought out a guitar, a classical guitar, nylon strings, hand-built, the kind of instrument that Segovia had built his entire philosophy around. Jimi picked it up and turned it over in his hands for a moment. He sat with it differently than he sat with his Stratocaster. More carefully, maybe, like he was being introduced to something and wanted to get it right. He started tuning it. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when something unplanned is about to happen and everyone can feel it coming. Segovia watched his hands. That was all. Just his hands. His expression still hadn't changed. Jimi took his time with the tuning. He wasn't stalling. He was listening to the instrument, learning it in the only way that mattered, which was through his fingers. each string twice, sometimes 3 times, until something satisfied him that nobody else could hear yet. Then he stopped adjusting. He sat still for a moment, and then he played. What he played, nobody remembers precisely. That's not as strange as it sounds. Music that lands that hard sometimes erases its own notes from memory. What remains is not the melody, but the feeling the melody left behind. He played slowly. That much everyone agrees on. There was no display of speed, no technical argument being made, just space between the notes, and the notes themselves arriving with a kind of weight that made you feel each one land before the next one came. He used the nylon strings the way he used everything, not to demonstrate what he could do, but to say something. The tone was softer than what anyone in that room expected from him. Warmer. Less like Jimi Hendrix playing a different instrument, and more like someone entirely new, someone none of them had met before. Halfway through, a woman standing near the door started to say something to the person beside her, and then stopped herself mid-sentence. She never finished it. Nobody asked what she had been about to say. Segovia didn't move. That was what the people nearest to him noticed first. The man had spent decades maintaining a particular physical composure. The posture of someone who understood that how you hold yourself communicates something. He always sat straight, hands visible, present but controlled. Somewhere in the middle of Jimmy's playing, that changed, not dramatically. He didn't lean forward or close his eyes or do anything obvious, but the people sitting close enough to watch him saw it. His hands, which had been folded in his lap with deliberate stillness, separated. His right hand moved slowly to the arm of the chair and rested there. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His body settled, like something he had been holding without realizing it had quietly let go. He looked like a man who had asked a question and received an answer he hadn't expected. When Jimmy stopped, Segovia didn't applaud. He didn't speak. He sat in that same position for a long moment, and then he looked down at his own hands resting in his lap, as if seeing them from a slight distance. The room stayed silent, not the polite silence that precedes applause. The other kind. The kind that means no one wants to be the first to interrupt. Jimmy set the guitar down carefully. He didn't look around the room to read reactions. He placed it down and looked at a fixed point in the middle distance, the way musicians sometimes do after playing, still partly inside the sound they've just finished making. Someone began to clap and the rest of the room followed, but the applause felt like it arrived a beat late, and everyone seemed to know it. Segovia stood eventually. He walked across the room at the same measured pace he moved through everything. He stopped in front of Jimmy. He said something. The accounts differ on exactly what. Most agree it was brief. One person standing nearby said Segovia spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish, and that only part of it carried clearly across the noise of the resumed room. What everyone agrees on is that Jimmy nodded once, quietly, and then Segovia walked back to his chair and sat down. He didn't speak much for the remainder of the evening. He left without ceremony, said goodbye to his host, collected his coat, and walked out. No one who was there ever heard him mention that night publicly. The story moved through rooms the way those stories do, picking up small variations with each telling, but always keeping its core intact. Some people believed it. Some thought it was embellished. Nobody who had actually been in that townhouse ever said it hadn't happened. 17 years later, in 1984, a Spanish music journal published a long conversation with one of Segovia's most devoted students, a guitarist who had studied under him for more than a decade. The interview covered technique, repertoire, the long work of building a classical tradition around an instrument most people had once considered too simple for concert stages. Near the end, the interviewer asked about Jimi Hendrix. It was an unusual question for that kind of piece. The student paused before answering. He said that in the final years of Segovia's life, he had asked him directly about that evening in London. He had heard the story secondhand and wanted to know if it was true. Segovia had been quiet for a long time before responding. Then he said this. He said he had spent 50 years trying to demonstrate that the guitar was not a simple instrument, that it required everything from a person, total commitment, years of silence and practice, and the willingness to sacrifice things that other people kept. He had believed for most of his life that the musicians who made noise with electric guitars were simply not doing that work, were not serious in the way the instrument required seriousness. And then he said, "That night I understood something I should have already known. Seriousness does not always look the same. Commitment can arrive in many forms. I heard that man play 20 notes, and I knew he had given himself entirely to that instrument, the same as I had, perhaps more, because he had done it without anyone ever telling him it was worth doing. The student asked if that changed how he felt about rock music more broadly. Segovia shook his head. No, he said. It changed how I felt about him. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. Segovia outlived him by 17 years, still performing, still teaching. He died in Madrid in 1987, the guitar always central to everything he thought and said and did. He never gave a public interview that mentioned Jimi Hendrix by name. He never wrote about that evening in Kensington. The closest thing to any acknowledgement was what he had told his student in private, in a conversation that only became known after Segovia himself was gone. Some people who encountered the story later found it difficult to believe. Segovia was not the kind of man to be easily moved by anything, they said, especially not by a rock guitarist with a habit of setting his instrument on fire. Maybe, but the people who had been in that room in 1967 tended to tell it the same way, regardless of how many years had passed. A man who had spent his entire life deciding what music deserved to be taken seriously sat down one evening and asked a younger man to prove himself. The younger man picked up an unfamiliar instrument and played something quiet, and the older man, for the first time in a very long time, sat still and found himself unsure of the answer. That was the whole story. That was enough.